There are stretches of highway no human should drive alone after midnight, and Route 66 through the Arizona wasteland is one of them. My name is Samuel Reaper Kowalski, and I've been haunting America's highways for 26 years, from the frozen tundra of northern Alaska to the sweltering bayous of Louisiana. I've driven every mile of asphalt this country has to offer. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what hunted me through 3 states on that October night, when the temperature dropped below freezing, and the desert wind carried sounds that human ears weren't meant to hear. Since that night, I sleep with a .45 under my pillow and check every shadow twice before stepping outside. The nightmares still come every few hours, jolting me awake with the memory of headlights that never blinked, never wavered, never showed mercy. Some predators hunt with claws and fangs, others hunt with chrome bumpers and bulletproof glass, turning America's highways into killing fields where truckers become prey for monsters that drive vehicles instead of stalking through forests. I was 58 years old then, a Vietnam veteran with 3 Purple Hearts and hands that had seen enough violence to fill a dozen lifetimes. My wife Margaret had died of cancer 2 years earlier, leaving me with nothing but the road and the endless miles that stretched between truck stops like veins carrying the lifeblood of American commerce. Driving had become my meditation, my escape from memories that whiskey couldn't drown and time couldn't heal. But the road has predators too, and some of them are patient enough to stalk their prey for hundreds of miles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That October run started in Flagstaff, Arizona, where I'd picked up a load of mining equipment destined for a copper operation outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Standard cargo, standard route, standard paperwork. Nothing to suggest that I was about to become the target of something so methodically evil that it would haunt my dreams for years to come. Route 66, the old mother road that once carried Dust Bowl refugees and post-war prosperity seekers across the American heartland, had been largely replaced by interstate highways. But sections of the original route still existed, winding through small towns and desert wilderness that modern traffic had forgotten. Truckers sometimes used these old stretches to avoid way stations, construction delays, or simply to experience a piece of American history that was slowly crumbling back into the desert. I'd decided to take the old route through Arizona and New Mexico, partly for nostalgia, partly to avoid a massive construction project on I-40 that was backing up traffic for hours. The mining equipment wasn't time-sensitive, and my dispatcher had given me flexibility in routing as long as I made the delivery deadline. That decision probably saved my life, though it also nearly ended it. I left Flagstaff at 11 p.m., planning to drive through the night and reach Amarillo, Texas by morning. The old route was nearly empty, just the occasional local traffic and a few other truckers who knew the area well enough to navigate the faded road signs and poorly maintained asphalt. The temperature was dropping fast as I climbed into the high desert country east of Flagstaff. My thermometer showed 38 degrees and falling, with a wind that was strong enough to rock my trailer and send tumbleweeds bouncing across the highway like ghostly soccer balls. The sky was clear but moonless, creating the kind of impenetrable darkness that makes you feel like you're driving through the void between stars. At milepost 87, just past the ghost town of Winona, I noticed the headlights behind me. They appeared suddenly, as if the vehicle had been sitting beside the road with its lights off, waiting for something specific to pass by. The lights were positioned wider apart than a normal passenger car, suggesting a larger vehicle, probably an SUV or pickup truck. They maintained a steady distance of maybe a quarter mile, neither gaining nor losing ground despite the changes in terrain and my varying speeds. At first, I didn't think much of it. Route 66 attracts all kinds of night travelers. Tourists following the historic route, locals who know the back roads, truckers like me who prefer the old highways to the modern interstates. Someone traveling in the same direction at the same speed wasn't necessarily cause for concern. But as the miles passed, something about those headlights began to bother me. They were too steady, too consistent, too perfectly matched to my own speed changes. When I slowed for curves, they slowed. When I accelerated on straightaways, they accelerated. When I downshifted for hills, they maintained the exact same following distance. It was as if the driver behind me was using some kind of electronic monitoring system to maintain perfect spacing, never varying the distance by more than a few yards despite the challenging driving conditions. I tried the CB radio, keying the microphone with the standard trucker greeting. Breaker 19, this is Reaper eastbound on the old 66. Got someone behind me running about a quarter-mile back. You copy, driver. Static filled the cab. I tried different channels, different call signs, different approaches. Nothing but the hiss of empty airwaves. Either the vehicle behind me didn't have a CB radio, or the driver wasn't interested in conversation. At Meteor City, a name that proved grimly prophetic, I pulled into a combination gas station, gift shop and diner that claimed to be Arizona's best-kept secret. The place was nearly deserted, except for a sleepy clerk and a couple of tourists examining displays of supposed meteorite fragments. I parked my rig in the well-lit area near the fuel pumps and watched my mirrors carefully. The headlights that had been following me continued past the station without slowing, disappearing around a curve about a mile down the road. I felt a brief moment of relief. Maybe I'd been imagining a threat where none existed. But as I was topping off my fuel tank, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Parked in the shadows behind the building, barely visible in the darkness, was a large black SUV with no front license plate. Its engine was running, evidenced by the vapor rising from its exhaust pipe, but its lights were completely dark. I walked casually toward the building, pretending to head for the restroom while actually trying to get a better look at the SUV. It was a late-model Chevrolet Suburban, black as funeral cloth, with heavily tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. The rear license plate area was empty. No plate, no temporary tags, nothing to identify the vehicle or its owner. Every instinct developed through 26 years of highway driving and 2 tours in Vietnam was screaming danger. Vehicles don't follow truckers for dozens of miles and then hide in parking lots without a reason. And that reason was rarely anything good. I paid for my fuel quickly and climbed back into my cab, checking the locks on both doors and making sure my emergency equipment was easily accessible. The .38 revolver I carried for protection was loaded and within reach, though I hoped I wouldn't need it. As I pulled back onto Route 66, heading east toward New Mexico, I watched my mirrors carefully. For several miles, the highway behind me remained empty, and I began to hope that I'd lost whatever had been following me. Then, at milepost 92, the headlights reappeared. This time they were closer, maybe an eighth of a mile behind me instead of a quarter mile, and this time there was something different about them. The lights seemed brighter, more intense, as if they'd been modified or upgraded beyond factory specifications. They cast harsh white beams that seemed to cut through the darkness with surgical precision. I tried the CB radio again, this time broadcasting on the emergency channel. Breaker emergency. This is Reaper on old Route 66 eastbound near milepost 95. I've got a vehicle following me that won't respond to radio calls. Black SUV, no plates, suspicious behavior. Any law enforcement monitoring this frequency? A response came back almost immediately, but not from law enforcement. The voice was electronically distorted, artificially deepened and mechanically altered, until it sounded barely human. Good evening, Reaper. We've been waiting to meet you. The words hit me like a physical blow. Whoever was following me had been listening to my CB transmissions and had equipment sophisticated enough to respond on any frequency. The electronic voice distortion suggested planning and preparation. This wasn't a random encounter or a case of mistaken identity. I keyed the microphone with hands that were suddenly shaking. Who is this? What do you want? We want to play a game, Reaper. A game of cat and mouse on the loneliest road in America. You're the mouse. The line went dead, returning to static. I frantically tried different channels, different frequencies, but the electronic voice didn't respond to any of my attempts at communication. In my mirrors, the headlights began to move closer. My first instinct was to floor the accelerator and try to outrun whatever was behind me. But Route 66 through that section of Arizona wasn't built for high-speed chases. The road surface was cracked and uneven, with sharp curves that could send a loaded truck tumbling into desert ravines. At night, in those conditions, excessive speed would be suicidal. Instead, I maintained a steady pace while trying to formulate a plan. The nearest large town was Winslow, still about 30 miles ahead. If I could reach populated areas, if I could find a police station or fire department, if I could get to somewhere with witnesses and help. The headlights were now close enough that I could see they belonged to a large SUV, the same black Suburban I'd seen at Meteor City, but now I could also see that it had been modified for purposes that had nothing to do with normal transportation. The front bumper had been replaced with a massive steel ramming guard, the kind used by law enforcement for stopping fleeing vehicles. Spotlights mounted on the roof could turn night into day with the flip of a switch. This wasn't just a vehicle, it was a weapon. The electronic voice crackled through my CB radio again. "You can't outrun us, Reaper. We know these roads better than you do. We've been hunting here for years." Hunting. The word choice was deliberate and terrifying. This wasn't road rage or a case of aggressive driving. It was predation, with me as the designated prey. "What do you want?" I transmitted back, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "We want to see how long you can survive. We want to see what you'll do when you realize there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no one coming to help you." The Suburban suddenly accelerated, closing the distance between us to less than 100 feet. At that range, I could see that the windshield was tinted so darkly that it was impossible to see inside. The vehicle looked like a machine from a nightmare, black, anonymous, implacable. Then the ramming began. The first impact came without warning, a solid hit to my trailer's rear corner that sent shockwaves through the entire rig. The collision was precisely calculated, hard enough to damage my vehicle and terrify me, but not quite hard enough to send me off the road immediately. I fought to maintain control as the trailer fishtailed behind me, the heavy mining equipment shifting and banging against the walls. My speed dropped to 40 miles per hour, then 30, as I struggled to keep the truck upright and moving forward. The second ram was harder, more centered, designed to maximum damage and intimidation. This time, the impact sent me partially into the oncoming lane before I could regain control and steer back to my side of the highway. If there had been oncoming traffic, the collision would have been fatal. The electronic voice filled my cab again, now containing an unmistakable tone of sadistic pleasure. "How does it feel, Reaper? How does it feel to be helpless?" I keyed my CB and shouted back, "You're going to kill us both if you keep this up. What's wrong with you?" Death is always a possibility. That's what makes the game interesting. Game. They were treating my terror, my potential death, as entertainment. I was dealing with people who viewed human life as nothing more than an amusing way to pass time on a lonely highway. The third ram was the hardest yet, catching my trailer at an angle that sent the entire rig sliding sideways across both lanes of the highway. I felt the sickening sensation of losing traction, of physics taking over from human control, of 50,000 pounds of truck and cargo becoming a guided missile aimed at the desert floor. Somehow I managed to regain control before sliding completely off the road, but the effort left me shaking with adrenaline and terror, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal trying to escape. The black Suburban backed off slightly, giving me just enough space to think I might have a chance to escape, then accelerated again for another ram. The psychological torture was as deliberate as the physical attacks, letting hope build up just enough to make its destruction more painful. But the brief respite gave me time to notice something crucial, a historical marker sign indicating that we were approaching Meteor Crater, one of Arizona's most famous tourist attractions. More importantly, the sign indicated that there was a visitors center and museum, facilities that might have security, communications equipment, and possibly even night staff. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope I had. As the Suburban lined up for another ramming attack, I suddenly veered onto the exit road that led to Meteor Crater. The maneuver caught my pursuers off guard, and they overshot the exit by several hundred yards before they could slow down and turn around. The road to the crater wound through desert hills, poorly lit and barely maintained, but it led away from the main highway and toward facilities that might offer sanctuary. My headlights carved tunnels of light through the darkness, illuminating Joshua trees and rock formations that looked like sleeping giants. Behind me, the Suburban's headlights reappeared, coming fast on the narrow road. But now, the playing field had changed. Instead of a straight highway where they could use their vehicle's speed and ramming power to maximum advantage, we were on a winding access road where size and weight could become liabilities. I pushed my truck as hard as I dared on the curves, using my knowledge of commercial vehicle handling to maintain speeds that the Suburban's driver might not be able to match. The mining equipment in my trailer provided stability on curves, while their top-heavy SUV would be more prone to rolling if they took corners too aggressively. The visitors center appeared ahead, a low building surrounded by parking areas and interpretive displays. But my heart sank when I saw that the facility was completely dark. No lights, no signs of staff, No indication that anyone was present who might help or call for assistance. I pulled into the parking area anyway, hoping that the building might have emergency phones or security systems, but as I climbed down from my cab, I could hear the Suburban's engine growing louder as it approached the parking area. I ran toward the building, trying doors and windows, looking for any way to get inside or contact help. Everything was locked tight, and the nearest phone was probably miles away. The Suburban roared into the parking area with its spotlights blazing, turning the desert night into artificial day. The lights were so bright they were physically painful, forcing me to shield my eyes while trying to find cover behind my truck. That's when I heard the doors. Not one door, but several. Multiple people getting out of the Suburban and spreading out to surround my truck. Footsteps on gravel, moving with military precision, coordinating their positions to cut off any possible escape routes. I drew my .38 revolver and crouched behind my trailer trying to see how many attackers I was facing. The spotlights made it impossible to see clearly, but I could make out at least 3 figures moving through the darkness, all of them carrying what looked like weapons. The electronic voice called out, no longer coming through the CB radio, but through some kind of portable amplifier. "Come out, Reaper. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "What do you want?" I shouted back, trying to keep my voice steady. "We want to finish the game. You've been more entertaining than most, but all games must end. Most." The word implied that I wasn't their first victim, that other truckers had faced the same terror on lonely highways and might not have been as lucky as I'd been so far. I heard footsteps moving closer, circling my position. These weren't random psychopaths acting on impulse. They were organized, equipped, and experienced in hunting human prey on America's highways. That's when I remembered the emergency flare kit in my truck's safety equipment compartment. Road flares burn at over 2,000 degrees and produce intense light that can be seen for miles. They're designed to signal distress and mark hazards, but they can also serve as weapons if used properly. I crept around to the driver's side of my cab, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. The spotlights were focused on the rear of my truck, leaving the front in relative darkness. I managed to reach the safety compartment and extract 3 emergency flares without being seen. The first flare ignited with a brilliant red flame that temporarily overwhelmed the spotlights and threw dancing shadows across the parking area. I hurled it toward the Suburban, where it landed on the hood and began burning through the paint and into the metal underneath. The attackers shouted in surprise and confusion, their night vision destroyed by the sudden flare of light. I lit the second flare and threw it toward the voices, forcing them to scatter and seek cover. The third flare I kept in my hand as I ran toward the Suburban. If I could disable their vehicle, if I could level the playing field, I might have a chance to escape, or at least force them into a fair fight. But as I approached the SUV, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The cargo area was full of equipment that had nothing to do with normal travel. There were restraints, duct tape, plastic tarps, and what looked like surgical instruments laid out on a portable table. This wasn't just about terrorizing me on the highway. They had been planning to take me somewhere for extended torture and eventual murder. I was looking at a mobile torture chamber, a killing machine disguised as a passenger vehicle. The realization that I was facing serial killers, not just aggressive drivers, gave me a surge of desperate strength. I shoved the burning flare into the SUV's interior, where it immediately ignited the upholstery and began spreading fire throughout the vehicle. Shouts of rage erupted from the darkness as my attackers realized their mobile base of operations was being destroyed. Gunshots began cracking through the night air, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly lightning as they fired at shadows and movement. I sprinted back toward my truck, zigzagging to avoid the bullets that were chipping paint and shattering glass around me. The keys were still in the ignition, and the engine roared to life as I cranked the starter. More gunshots shattered my driver's side window as I threw the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The heavy rig lurched forward, diesel engine screaming as I aimed directly at the burning Suburban that was blocking the parking area exit. The collision was tremendous. 50,000 pounds of truck and cargo smashing into a burning SUV at 30 miles per hour. The impact sent the Suburban tumbling across the parking area like a toy, its fuel tank rupturing and adding an orange fireball to the red glow of the road flares. But the collision also damaged my truck severely. The front axle was bent, the radiator was leaking, and the steering felt loose and unpredictable. I might have disabled my attacker's vehicle, but I'd also crippled my own escape vehicle in the process. I managed to get back onto the access road, but my truck was barely limping along at 15 miles per hour. Steam was pouring from under the hood, and warning lights were flashing across my dashboard like a Christmas tree. The engine was overheating rapidly, and I knew I had only minutes before it would seize up completely. Behind me, the visitors' center was fully engulfed in flames from the burning SUV and road flares, but I couldn't see any signs of my attackers. Either they'd been killed in the explosion, or they were following on foot through the darkness. The access road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, winding through desert hills that offered no shelter and no help. My truck was dying with every mile, the engine temperature climbing into the red zone despite my attempts to nurse it along. At what felt like the last possible moment, I saw lights ahead, not the harsh spotlights of my pursuers, but the warm yellow glow of inhabited buildings. A small desert community appeared around a curve, probably workers' housing for the crater facility, or a tiny settlement that barely existed on any map. I coasted into the town with my engine finally seizing, steam erupting from the radiator like a geyser, metal parts grinding and screaming their death throes. The truck rolled to a stop in front of what looked like a general store, with a payphone mounted on the outside wall. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911, but I managed to get through to the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher who answered probably thought I was drunk or insane, as I tried to explain what had happened. Truckers being hunted by serial killers with a mobile torture chamber disguised as an SUV didn't fit any standard emergency protocols. But the explosion and fire at the visitors' center were visible from miles away, and fire departments were already responding to reports of a major blaze in the desert. The dispatcher agreed to send sheriff's deputies to my location, while firefighters dealt with the burning facilities. It took 3 hours for the first deputy to reach the small desert community where I was stranded. By then, I'd had time to examine my truck's damage and realize how close I'd come to never making it out alive. The bullet holes in my cab, the smashed windows, the bent frame, all of it testified to an encounter with predators who had turned highway hunting into a deadly art form. Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos was a 20-year veteran who'd seen every kind of violence the desert could produce, but even she was shaken by my account of the attack. The mobile torture chamber, the electronic voice distortion, the coordinated hunt across multiple counties, it suggested a level of organization and premeditation that elevated simple highway violence into something approaching military operations. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the horror I'd escaped. The burning wreckage of the SUV contained enough evidence to link it to at least 12 missing persons cases across 4 states. Truckers mostly, but also solo travelers who'd made the mistake of driving alone through remote areas where predators could operate without witnesses. The torture equipment found in the wreckage was sophisticated and extensive. Medical restraints, surgical instruments, recording equipment for documenting their victims' suffering. These weren't impulsive killers acting on sudden violent urges. They were methodical predators who had turned murder into a systematic operation with mobile facilities and carefully planned hunting grounds. But the most chilling discovery was a laptop computer that had survived the fire, partially intact. Digital forensics experts were able to recover fragments of files that contained detailed profiles of potential victims, truckers whose routes, schedules, and personal information had been researched and catalogued like entries in a hunting guide. My name was in those files. Samuel Reaper Kowalski, age 58, Vietnam veteran, recent widower, typically travels alone on less traveled routes, carries minimal communications equipment, drives predictable schedules between regular pickup and delivery points. They had been hunting me specifically. The encounter on Route 66 wasn't random. It was the culmination of weeks or months of surveillance and planning. They knew my route, my schedule, my vehicle, and my vulnerabilities better than I knew them myself. The realization that I'd been stalked for weeks without knowing it was almost worse than the actual attack. How long had they been watching? How many times had I passed them on highways without recognizing the danger? How many opportunities had they passed up before deciding Route 66 was the perfect hunting ground for their twisted game? 3 bodies were eventually found in the wreckage of the SUV, burned beyond easy identification, but matching the general physical descriptions of suspects in several missing persons cases. DNA evidence and dental records confirmed that they were wanted in connection with highway murders across the southwestern United States, but investigators suspected There were more members of the group who hadn't been present that night. The operation was too sophisticated, too well-funded, and too widespread to be the work of just 3 individuals. Somewhere out there, other predators were continuing the hunt, looking for replacement vehicles and new hunting grounds. The investigation made national news, and I found myself reluctantly famous as the trucker who fought back. Television interviews, newspaper articles, law enforcement training seminars. Everyone wanted to hear about how I'd survived an encounter with highway serial killers. But the attention also made me a target for copycat killers, revenge seekers connected to the original group, and other predators who saw me as either a challenge to be eliminated or a famous victim whose death would bring them notoriety. I had to leave my home in Phoenix and move to a different state under an assumed identity. The trucking company provided armed security during the transition, and law enforcement agencies offered witness protection services. But ultimately, the only real safety lay in changing everything about how I lived and worked. I bought a different truck, changed my appearance, modified my routes and schedules, and began carrying enough firepower to equip a small army. The .38 revolver was replaced by a .45 automatic pistol, a 12-gauge shotgun, and enough ammunition to fight a sustained battle. But the biggest change was psychological. The road that had once been my sanctuary, my escape from painful memories, had become a hunting ground where predators used sophisticated surveillance and military-style tactics to stalk human prey. Every truck stop, every rest area, every lonely stretch of highway could be an ambush site. I couldn't drive alone anymore. Every shadow might hide a surveillance team. Every vehicle that maintained consistent distance might be starting a new hunt. Every electronic voice on the CB radio might be announcing the beginning of another deadly game. The nightmares came every night for months. Visions of spotlights, ramming attacks, electronic voices promising death. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my hand reaching for weapons that weren't there in the safety of a motel room. Eleanor, my sister who lived in Montana, convinced me to seek professional help after I showed up at her door one night, babbling about being followed by vehicles that existed only in my imagination. The PTSD diagnosis wasn't surprising. I'd survived Vietnam, survived losing my wife to cancer, and then survived a coordinated murder attempt by highway serial killers. My mind had simply reached its breaking point. The therapy helped, but it couldn't erase the fundamental truth I'd learned on Route 66. There are human predators who hunt along America's highways, turning the road system into their personal killing ground. They have resources, organization, and techniques that make them far more dangerous than random criminals or mentally ill individuals acting alone. The trucking industry tried to minimize the story, fearing that publicity about highway serial killers would hurt recruitment and create panic among drivers. But word spread through the informal networks that connect truckers across the country: CB radio conversations, truck stop bulletin boards, online forums where drivers share information about dangerous routes and suspicious activities. Slowly, a picture emerged of a problem much larger than anyone had imagined. Truckers reported encounters with vehicles that followed them for hundreds of miles, mysterious voices on CB radios making threats, coordinated attacks by multiple vehicles working together. The isolation that made trucking attractive to independent-minded drivers also made them perfect targets for predators who understood that help might be hours away on a desert highway. Some companies began providing armed security escorts for drivers traveling through high-risk areas. Others installed satellite tracking and emergency communication systems that could summon help immediately when attacks occurred. The better companies started training drivers to recognize surveillance techniques, evasive driving tactics, and weapons handling. But many companies did nothing, either from ignorance or from concern about the costs of enhanced security measures. Drivers working for these companies continued to face the same risks I'd encountered, often with less preparation and fewer resources for defending themselves. I eventually returned to trucking, but with a completely different approach to the profession. Instead of long-haul routes through remote areas, I focused on shorter runs between major cities where help was never far away. Instead of driving alone, I traveled in informal convoys with other drivers who understood the risks and were prepared to provide mutual protection. Most importantly, I became an advocate for trucker safety awareness, speaking at industry conferences and training seminars about the reality of highway predators. The message was simple, but crucial. The road has monsters, and pretending they don't exist only makes their hunting easier. The presentation always included photographs from the burned SUV wreckage, the restraints, the surgical instruments, the torture equipment. Audiences would fall silent as they realized they were looking at tools designed specifically for prolonged human suffering. The reality of what highway predators could do to isolated victims was far worse than most people imagined. But I also emphasized that predators could be stopped, that drivers who were prepared and vigilant could survive even coordinated attacks by well-equipped killers. The flare strategy had worked because it used equipment that every truck was required to carry, turning safety devices into defensive weapons when necessary. The key was recognizing the warning signs early, vehicles maintaining consistent following distances, electronic voice modification on CB radios, unusual surveillance activities at truck stops. Anything that suggested normal highway encounters had become something more sinister. Most attacks could be avoided entirely if drivers trusted their instincts and took evasive action as soon as something felt wrong. The predators I'd encountered had been successful because their previous victims had either ignored the warning signs or hadn't understood what they were seeing until it was too late to escape. My experience became part of law enforcement training programs across multiple states. Police academies, state trooper training facilities, and FBI courses on highway crimes included case studies based on the Route 66 attack. The techniques used by my attackers, electronic surveillance, coordinated vehicle operations, mobile torture facilities, became part of the curriculum for officers who might encounter similar predators. But the most important audience was other truckers. Every driver who heard my story and learned to recognize the warning signs was one less potential victim. Every trucker who installed better communications equipment, carried defensive weapons, or modified their routes to avoid high-risk areas was reducing the hunting opportunities available to highway predators. The road had taught me its most terrifying lesson on that October night when temperature dropped below freezing, and I discovered that some monsters hunt with vehicles instead of claws. But it had also taught me that even the most sophisticated predators could be defeated by ordinary people who refused to become victims. The black SUV without plates had been hunting me for weeks before striking on Route 66, but their careful planning had included a crucial error. They'd underestimated their prey. They'd expected a terrified victim who would submit to capture and torture without fighting back. Instead, they'd encountered a Vietnam veteran who understood violence, recognized predatory behavior, and was willing to use every available resource to survive. The road flares, the ramming attack, the willingness to destroy my own truck to deny them their mobile base of operations, all of it had combined to turn their carefully planned hunt into a disaster that exposed their entire operation. The lesson for other truckers was clear. Predators can be stopped, but only by drivers who are prepared to recognize the threat and fight back with everything they have. Passive victims are what highway killers depend on, and refusing to become passive is the first step toward survival. Since Route 66, I've never forgotten that lesson. Every mile I drive is a mile of awareness. Every truck stop a potential surveillance site. Every vehicle that maintains consistent distance a possible threat. The vigilance is exhausting, but it's also necessary in a world where highways have become hunting grounds and truckers have become prey. The road is still beautiful, still inspiring, still the backbone of American commerce and culture, but it's also dangerous in ways that most people don't understand and can't imagine. There are human predators out there who view isolated drivers as entertainment, as victims to be stalked and tortured for their own twisted satisfaction. The only defense is awareness, preparation, and the willingness to fight back when fighting is the only option left. The monsters are real, they're organized, and they're hunting right now on highways across America. But they can be stopped. They can be defeated. They can be exposed and eliminated by ordinary people who refuse to become victims and who understand that sometimes survival requires turning safety equipment into weapons and trucks into battering rams. That's what Route 66 taught me on the night, when electronic voices promised death and spotlights turned darkness into a killing field. The road has predators, but it also has prey that can fight back. And sometimes, the prey wins.